Brina, a young black girl wandering alone in the park, slips a mysterious note into Officer Ben's pocket. When he finally reads the two words written inside, his heart nearly stops in disbelief. What those words reveal pushes Officer Ben into a race against time to uncover a conspiracy that could destroy everything. Before we get into the story, comment below where in the world you are watching from today. And if you like this story, don't forget to subscribe. Officer Ben Hartman's patrol car rolled slowly down the quiet suburban street. The early morning sun cast long shadows across neatly trimmed lawns and cookie-cutter houses. Ben's eyes scanned the area, more out of habit than expectation. Nothing ever happened in this peaceful neighborhood. As he approached the local playground, something caught his attention. A small figure stood alone by the swings, looking lost and scared. Ben's heart tightened in his chest. It was a young black girl, no more than 10 years old. He slowed the car to a stop, his mind racing. The sight of the child stirred memories he'd tried so hard to bury. His beloved wife, Nita, her face pale and drawn after years of battling illness. Their daughter, Emily, her eyes filled with a pain Ben couldn't understand until it was too late. Ben closed his eyes for a moment, willing the memories away. The loss of his family had left a gaping hole in his heart, one he'd tried to fill with work and long, lonely nights. He'd become a shell of the man he once was, going through the motions of life without really living. But something about this little girl tugged at him, awakening a part of himself he thought was long dead. His protective instincts, honed by years on the force, kicked in. He couldn't just drive by and leave her there. With a deep breath, Ben stepped out of the car. The cool morning air nipped at his face as he walked towards the playground. The girl's eyes widened as she saw him approach, fear flickering across her young face. "Hey there," Ben called out softly, trying to keep his voice gentle and non-threatening. "Are you okay?" The girl didn't answer, her small hands gripping the chain of the swing tightly. Ben's heart ached at the sight of her obvious distress. He knelt down, bringing himself to her eye level. "My name's Officer Ben," he said, pointing to his badge. "I'm here to help. What's your name?" For a long moment, the girl just stared at him, her dark eyes wide and wary. Then, in a voice barely above a whisper, she spoke. "Brina." Ben smiled, relief washing over him. It was a start. "Nice to meet you, Brina. Can you tell me why you're out here all alone?" Brina's lower lip trembled, and Ben could see tears forming in her eyes. His chest tightened with concern. What had happened to this poor child? "It's okay," he said softly. "You can trust me. I'm here to help." As he looked at Brina's frightened face, Ben felt something stir within him. It was a feeling he hadn't experienced in years, a desire to protect, to care. For the first time since losing his family, Ben felt a spark of purpose ignite in his heart. Ben knelt there, his heart heavy with concern for the frightened child before him. Brina's eyes darted around, never quite meeting his gaze. Her small hands twisted the hem of her worn t-shirt, a nervous habit that spoke volumes. "Brina," Ben said softly, "can you tell me why you're out here all alone? Are you lost?" The little girl shook her head, her braids swaying slightly. She opened her mouth as if to speak, then closed it again, fear etched across her young face. Ben tried again, his voice gentle. "Is everything okay at home? Do you need help?" Brina's lower lip trembled, but still she remained silent. Ben's heart ached for her. He'd seen that look before, in the eyes of his own daughter. The memory sent a sharp pain through his chest. "It's all right," he assured her. "You can trust me. I'm here to help you." But Brina just stared at the ground, her small body tense with anxiety. Ben sighed, realizing he wasn't getting anywhere. He slowly stood up, his knees creaking in protest. "Okay, Brina, I won't force you to talk if you don't want to," he said. "But if you ever need help, you can always find me or another police officer, all right?" Ben turned to walk away, his steps slow and reluctant. He hated leaving her like this, but he couldn't force her to open up. On his car suddenly, he felt a small Haben Hesby and brush against his leg. Before he could react, Brina had slipped something into his pocket. In a flash, she was gone, her little feet carrying her swiftly across the playground and out of sight. Stunned, Ben reached into his pocket and pulled out a folded piece of paper, his brow furrowed in confusion as he stared after the retreating figure of the little girl. What had just happened? He sat there for a moment, the note burning a hole in his hand, torn between chasing after Brina and respecting her obvious need for secrecy. In the end, he decided to let her go. Whatever was going on, she had chosen to trust him with this message. He wouldn't betray that trust by forcing her to stay. With a heavy heart, Ben drove back to the police station, the folded note clutched tightly in his hand. He couldn't shake the feeling that something was terribly wrong, and that this little girl needed his help more than she could say. Back at the police station, Ben sat heavily in his chair, the folded note still clutched in his hand. His heart raced as he slowly opened it, dreading what he might find. The paper crinkled softly, revealing a child's messy scrawl. 2 simple words stared back at him. "I'm sorry." Ben's breath caught in his throat. The world around him faded away as memories flooded his mind. Another note, another time. His daughter's last words, scribbled hastily before she took her own life. "I'm sorry, Dad, I can't do this anymore. I love you." The pain hit him like a physical blow. Ben's hands shook as he set the note on his desk. He closed his eyes, trying to push back the tide of grief threatening to overwhelm him. But he couldn't escape the connection. This child, Brina, reaching out in the only way she knew how, just like his daughter had done. The thought of another young life in danger sent a chill down his spine. Ben took a deep breath, forcing himself to focus. He couldn't change the past, but maybe he could make a difference for this little girl. He had to find her, to understand what was happening. He picked up the note again, studying it closely. The paper was torn from a notebook, the edges ragged. Smudges of dirt marred the corners, as if it had been carried around for a while before being given to him. Ben's mind raced with questions. What was Brina sorry for? Was she in trouble? Hurt? The fear in her eyes at the playground haunted him. Something was clearly wrong. But what? He couldn't shake the feeling that time was running out. The urgency he felt was all too familiar. The same desperation that had gripped him when he realized his daughter was in crisis. But this time, he had a chance to act before it was too late. Ben stood up, determination replacing his earlier grief. He had to find Brina, to make sure she was safe. He owed it to her, and to the memory of his own child, to do everything in his power to help. As he gathered his things to head back out, Ben's gaze fell on a photo on his desk. His wife and daughter smiled back at him, frozen in a happier time. He touched the frame gently, drawing strength from their memory. "I won't fail this time," he whispered. "I promise." With renewed purpose, Ben left the station, the note tucked safely in his pocket. He didn't know where this would lead, but he was determined to find Brina and uncover the truth behind her cryptic message. Ben's hands trembled as he's sitting on his desk. The weight of Brina's note pressed against his chest, tucked safely in his shirt pocket. As he drove through the quiet streets, memories of his daughter flooded his mind. He remembered the signs he had missed, her withdrawal, the sudden mood swings, the way her smile never quite reached her eyes. Ben had been so consumed by his wife's illness that he'd failed to see his daughter's silent cry for help. The guilt gnawed at him, a constant ache that never truly faded. Now, as he searched for Brina, that familiar fear gripped him once again. He couldn't shake the feeling that history was repeating itself. The scared look in Brina's eyes, the cryptic note, it all felt eerily familiar. "Not this time," Ben M. uttered, his jaw clenching with determination. "I won't let another child slip through the cracks." Back at his car, he drove past the playground where he'd first seen Brina, scanning the area for any sign of the young girl. The swings swayed gently in the breeze, empty and forlorn. Ben's heart sank, but he refused to give up. As he turned down another street, Ben's mind raced with possibilities. What could Brina be sorry for? Was she in danger? The not knowing was torture. bringing back painful memories of the night he'd found his daughter. Ben shook his head, trying to clear the dark thoughts. He needed to focus, to think like the experienced police officer he was. Where would a scared young girl go? Ben's heart sank as he scanned the empty playground. The swings swayed gently in the breeze, but there was no sign of Brina. He walked around the perimeter, his eyes searching every nook and cranny where a frightened child might hide. "Brina," he called out softly, hoping she might be nearby. But only silence answered him. Determined not to give up, Ben approached a couple walking their dog near the park. "Excuse me," he said, showing his badge. "I'm looking for a young girl named Brina. Have you seen her around here today?" The couple shook their heads, their faces etched with concern. "Sorry, officer," the woman replied. "We haven't seen any children here this afternoon." Ben thanked them and moved on, asking everyone he encountered. A jogger, a mother with a stroller, an elderly man feeding pigeons. No one had seen Brina. With each negative response, Ben felt his worry grow. As the sun began to dip lower in the sky, Ben realized he needed to change his approach. He climbed back into his patrol car and headed towards the nearest elementary school. Even though it was after hours, he hoped someone might still be there who could help. Luck was on his side. As he pulled into the parking lot, Ben saw a light on in the main office. He hurried inside, finding the school secretary packing up for the day. "Can I help you, officer?" she asked, looking up from her desk. Ben explained the situation, describing Brina as best he could. "I'm hoping you might recognize her or know her family," he finished, his voice tinged with urgency. The secretary's brow furrowed in concentration. "We don't have any students named Brina," she said slowly. "But your description, it sounds a bit like Brenna Mae Willow. She's in 5th grade." Ben felt a glimmer of hope. "Do you have any contact information for her family?" The secretary hesitated. "I'm not supposed to give out personal information, but given the circumstances..." She turned to her computer, typing quickly. "Here's the address we have on file. It's not far from here." As Ben jotted down the address, the secretary added, "Officer, Brina's had a tough time lately. Her mother's been ill, and I think they're struggling. If she's in trouble..." Ben nodded, understanding the unspoken concern. "I'll do everything I can to help," he promised. Ben sat across from the school counselor, Ms. Thompson, in her small office. The walls were covered with colorful posters about kindness and self-esteem. He leaned forward, his elbows on his knees as he listened intently. "Brina Mae Willow," Ms. Thompson said, her voice soft with concern. "She's a very quiet child, Officer Hartman. Always polite. But she keeps to herself most of the time." Ben nodded, picturing the scared little girl from the playground. "Has she ever caused any trouble?" Ms. Thompson shook her head. "No, never. If anything, she's almost too well behaved. It's like she's trying not to be noticed." A familiar ache settled in Ben's chest. He recognized that behavior all too well. "What about her home life? The secretary mentioned her mother was ill." The counselor's face fell. "Yes, that's been hard on Brina. Her mother, Alina, has been battling a chronic illness for the past year. It's taken a toll on the whole family." Ben's mind flashed to his own wife's illness, the long days in the hospital, the helplessness he'd felt. "How has Brina been coping?" Ms. Thompson sighed. "As well as can be expected, I suppose. But I worry she's taking on too much. She's often tired in class and her homework isn't always complete. When I've spoken to her about it, she just says she's been helping at home." "Helping how?" Ben asked, his concern growing. "From what I understand, she's been doing a lot of the housework, cooking meals, even trying to care for her younger brother." Ms. Thompson's eyes were filled with sympathy. "It's far too much responsibility for a child her age." Ben felt a lump form in his throat. He thought of his own daughter, how she'd struggled silently until it was too late. He couldn't let that happen to Brina. "Has Child Services been notified?" he asked, his voice rough with emotion. Ms. Thompson nodded. "We've made reports, but with the backlog in the system, well, it's been slow going. And Brina is so protective of her family. She's scared of being separated from them." Ben understood that fear all too well. He stood up, his determination renewed. "Thank you for your help, Ms. Thompson. I'm going to do everything I can to help Brina and her family." As he left the school, Ben's mind was racing. He had a clearer picture now of what Brina was facing, but it only made him more worried. A child shouldn't have to carry such a heavy burden. He knew he had to find her, to offer whatever help he could. With renewed determination, Ben headed back to his car. He had a lead now, a place to start. As he drove towards the Johnson home, he silently prayed that Brina, or Brina May, would be there, safe and sound. Ben pulled up to the modest single-story house on Maple Street. The front yard was overgrown, with weeds poking through the patchy grass. Paint peeled from the weathered siding, and a broken shutter hung askew from a front window. The sight made Ben's heart sink. He stepped out of his patrol car and approached the front door, his footsteps crunching on the gravel driveway. The silence that enveloped the property was unsettling. No sounds of children playing, no TV noise, not even a barking dog in the distance. Ben knocked firmly on the door. "Hello, Mrs. Willow, Brina, is anyone home?" His voice echoed in the quiet neighborhood. He waited, straining to hear any movement inside. Nothing. Ben knocked again, louder this time. "This is Officer Hartman. I'm here to help. Please, if anyone's home, open the door." Still no response. Ben's worry deepened. He cupped his hands around his eyes and peered through a grimy window. The living room was dark, but he could make out a messy interior. Dishes piled on a coffee table, clothes strewn across the floor. A chill ran down Ben's spine. Something wasn't right here. He walked around the side of the house, checking windows, looking for any sign of life. Each silent, empty room he saw only increased his alarm. Returning to the front of the house, Ben noticed an elderly woman watching him from her porch next door. He approached her, hoping for some answers. "Excuse me, ma'am," he said, showing his badge. "I'm Officer Hartman. Do you know the family that lives here?" The woman nodded, her face etched with concern. "The Willows. Poor dears. Alina's been so sick, and those children. Is everything all right, officer?" Ben tried to keep his voice calm. "I'm not sure. Have you seen Mrs. Willow or the children recently?" The neighbor furrowed her brow. "Now that you mention it, I haven't seen Alina in days. The children sometimes, coming and going, but it's been awfully quiet over there lately." Ben's heart raced. Days without seeing Alina, and the children left alone? His mind conjured worst-case scenarios, each more distressing than the last. "What about today?" he asked urgently. "Have you seen Brina or her brother?" The woman shook her head. "Not since yesterday morning. Brina was taking out the trash. She looked so tired, poor thing." Ben thanked the neighbor and walked back to the Willow house, his concern now full-blown alarm. He stood on the front porch, staring at the silent door, his mind racing with possibilities. Where was Alina? Where were the children? And most importantly, were they safe? Ben's heart raced as he drove through the quiet streets, his eyes scanning every corner for a glimpse of Brina. The image of her frightened face at the playground haunted him, spurring him on. As he passed the local grocery store, something caught his eye, a flash of movement behind the dumpsters. He pulled over and got out of his patrol car, approaching cautiously. "Brina," he called softly. "It's Officer Hartman. Are you back there?" A small figure emerged from behind the dumpster, and Ben's heart clenched. It was Brina, looking even more scared and disheveled than before. Her clothes were wrinkled and her hair was tangled. She stared at Ben with wide, fearful eyes. "Hey there," Ben said gently, crouching down to her level. "It's Officer Ben. Remember me from earlier? I've been looking for you. Are you okay?" Brina shook her head, her lower lip trembling. Ben noticed she was clutching a small, worn backpack to her chest. "I got your note," he said gently. "I'm here to help, Brina. Whatever's wrong, we can figure it out together. You don't have to be sorry, and you don't have to face this alone." Brina's lip trembled, fresh tears spilling down her cheeks. Ben felt a lump form in his throat, his own eyes stinging with unshed tears. He'd failed his daughter, but he wouldn't fail Brina. This time, he would listen. This time, he would help. "Can you tell me what's going on?" Ben asked, keeping his voice soft and reassuring. "I want to help you, Brina. Where's your mom?" At the mention of her mother, Brina's eyes filled with tears. "Mom's sick," she whispered, her voice barely audible. Ben's chest tightened. "She's sick? Is that why you're out here alone?" Brina nodded, sniffling. "She told me to get help, but I don't know what to do." "You did the right thing by reaching out to me," Ben said, offering a small smile. "Can you tell me more about your mom? How long has she been sick?" But as Ben tried to coax more information from her, Brina's eyes darted around nervously. Before he could react, she clutched her backpack tighter and bolted, disappearing around the corner of the building. "Brina, wait!" Ben called out, but it was too late. He stood up, frustration and worry battling inside him. He had been so close to getting answers, to finding out what was really going on with this family. Ben ran a hand through his hair, his mind racing. Brina was clearly terrified, and her mother was sick, possibly seriously ill. But why was Brina so afraid to accept help? What else was going on that she wasn't telling him? Determination set in as Ben walked back to his patrol car. He wasn't going to give up. Somehow, he was going to find a way to help Brina and her family, no matter what it took. Ben's determination to uncover the truth about Brina's situation grew with each passing moment. He knew he had to dig deeper, to understand what was really going on with this family. With a heavy heart and a sense of purpose, he set out to ask around town about Alina. His first stop was the local pharmacy. The pharmacist, a kind-faced woman named Nanita, recognized Alina's name immediately. "Oh, poor Alina," Nanita said, shaking her head. "She's been having such a hard time lately. Her prescriptions have been piling up, but she can't afford to pick them up." Ben's brow furrowed. "Do you know why she's struggling financially?" Nanita leaned in, lowering her voice. "Well, I shouldn't gossip, but word around town is that she got caught up in some kind of scam. Lost a lot of money from what I hear." This new information hit Ben like a punch to the gut. He thanked Nanita and left, his mind reeling. A financial scam on top of Alina's illness? No wonder Brina looked so scared and desperate. Next, Ben visited the local diner. The waitress, Betty, had known Alina for years. "That poor woman," Betty sighed, refilling Ben's coffee cup. "She used to come in here all the time with her kids, but lately, I've only seen Brina picking up takeout. That little girl looks like she's carrying the weight of the world on her shoulders." Ben's heart sank. The picture was becoming clearer, and it was more troubling than he'd imagined. Brina wasn't just dealing with a sick mother. She was trying to keep her family afloat all on her own. As Ben continued his inquiries, a pattern emerged. Everyone in town seemed to know bits and pieces of Alina's struggles, but no one had realized the full extent of the situation. The financial scam had drained what little resources the family had, leaving Alina unable to afford her medication or proper care. Ben's worry for Brina intensified. She was just a child, yet she was shouldering adult responsibilities. The stress of caring for her sick mother, managing the household and trying to keep their dire situation a secret, was clearly taking its toll. Sitting in his patrol car, Ben stared at the steering wheel, his mind racing. Brina was in more trouble than he'd initially thought. She needed help, and she needed it now. But how could he convince her to trust him? How could he break through the walls of fear and secrecy she'd built around herself and her family? Ben knew one thing for certain. He couldn't give up. Somewhere in this town, a little girl was fighting a battle far too big for her, and he was determined to be the help she so desperately needed. Ben's police cruiser pulled into the hospital parking lot, its tires crunching on the asphalt. He sat for a moment, gathering his thoughts before stepping out. The automatic doors whooshed open as he entered, the sterile smell of disinfectant hitting his nostrils. At the reception desk, a tired-looking nurse greeted him. "Can I help you, officer?" Ben cleared his throat. "I'm here about a patient, Alina Willow. I'm concerned about her welfare." The nurse's eyes widened slightly. "Oh, Alina. Let me get Dr. Patel for you." A few minutes later, a petite woman in a white coat approached. "Officer, I'm Dr. Patel. You're inquiring about Alina Willow?" Ben nodded, his heart racing. Yes, I'm worried about her and her daughter, Brina. Dr. Patel's face fell. We've been concerned about Alina, too. She's missed her last few treatments. We've tried calling, but there's been no answer. Ben's stomach twisted. What kind of treatments? Alina has a chronic condition that requires regular care, Dr. Patel explained. Without her medication and treatments, her health could deteriorate rapidly. The weight of the situation pressed down on Ben's shoulders. And you haven't heard from her at all? Dr. Patel shook her head. We don't have the resources to do home visits or follow up beyond phone calls. We were hoping she'd come in soon. Ben's mind raced, thinking of Brina's frightened face. Is there anything else you can tell me about their situation? The doctor hesitated, then spoke softly. Alina's been struggling financially. She's had trouble affording her treatments. We've been working with her on payment plans, but… Ben nodded, understanding. The pieces were falling into place, each one more worrying than the last. Thank you, Dr. Patel, Ben said, his voice tight. You've been very helpful. As Ben walked back to his car, his fear for Brina grew. The little girl wasn't just dealing with a sick mother. She was facing a potentially life-threatening situation. Ben's hands shook slightly as he opened his car door. He had to find Brina and Alina, and he had to find them soon. Ben sat in his patrol car, his mind whirling with the information he'd gathered. He couldn't shake the feeling that something was terribly wrong. With a deep breath, he pulled out his phone and dialed the station. Hey, Mike, he said to the desk sergeant. I need you to pull some files for me. It's about a possible scam targeting vulnerable families. Mike's voice crackled through the speaker. Sure thing, Ben. What are we looking at? I'm not sure yet, Ben replied, his voice low. But I think it might be connected to one of our own. There was a pause on the other end. Ben, that's a serious accusation. You sure about this? No, Ben admitted. That's why I need those files. Can you get them to me? I'll do what I can, Mike said. Give me an hour. Ben spent the next 60 minutes parked outside the hospital, his mind racing. When his phone buzzed, he answered it immediately. Ben, you need to see this, Mike said, his voice tense. I'm sending you some files now. It's not good. Ben's tablet pinged with an incoming message. He opened the files, his eyes scanning the documents rapidly. As he read, his stomach twisted into knots. The files showed a pattern of complaints from families who had been targeted by financial scams. But what made Ben's blood run cold was the name that kept appearing in connection with these cases. Officer James Reeves. Reeves was a fellow officer, someone Ben had worked with for years. He was well liked, always ready with a joke or a helping hand. But according to these files, he had been using his position to identify vulnerable families and pass their information to scammers. Ben's hands clenched into fists. He thought of Alina, sick and struggling, and of Brina, scared and alone. How many other families had Reeves hurt? Mike, Ben said into the phone, his voice shaking with anger. We need to bring Reeves in, now. Ben, wait, Mike cautioned. We need more evidence. If we move too fast, he might destroy any proof we could use against him. Ben knew Mike was right, but the thought of Reeves continuing to hurt people made his skin crawl. Okay, he said finally. But we need to move fast. There's a little girl out there who needs our help. As Ben ended the call, he felt a mix of emotions churning inside him. Anger at Reeves for betraying his oath to protect and serve. Disgust at the thought that one of their own could exploit vulnerable people. But most of all, he felt a renewed determination to help Brina and her mother. Ben started his car, his mind made up. He would find Brina and Alina, and he would make sure they were safe. And then, he would bring Reeves to justice, no matter what it took. Ben sat in his patrol car, staring at the files on his tablet. The evidence against Officer James Reeves was damning, but the implications were staggering. Reeves wasn't just any cop. He was a decorated officer with 20 years on the force. He'd mentored rookies, led community outreach programs, and was even up for a promotion to sergeant. The weight of the decision before him pressed down on Ben's shoulders. If he went forward with his suspicions, it would shake the entire department to its core. There would be investigations, Internal affairs would get involved, and the public's trust in the police force would be severely damaged. Ben closed his eyes, remembering Brina's frightened face and the desperation in her note. He thought of Alina, sick and alone, victim to a scam that had left her family in ruins. How many others had suffered because of Reeves's actions? "Damn it," Ben muttered, running a hand through his hair. He knew what he had to do, but the cost would be high. Accusing Reeves would make him a pariah in the department. He'd lose friends, face skepticism from his colleagues, and possibly even jeopardize his own career. The blue wall of silence was real, and breaking it came with consequences. But as Ben wrestled with his conscience, he couldn't shake the memory of his daughter's suicide note. He had failed her, missed the signs of her suffering. Now he had a chance to make a difference for another child in need. "I can't let her down," Ben whispered to himself, his resolve strengthening. "I won't fail another child." The decision crystallized in his mind. He would pursue this no matter the cost to himself. Brina and Alina needed him, and he wouldn't let them down. The department might never forgive him, but Ben knew he'd never forgive himself if he turned a blind eye to corruption and let innocent people suffer. With a deep breath, Ben picked up his phone to call his captain. It was time to blow the whistle on Reeves and face whatever consequences came his way. As he dialed the number, Ben felt a mix of dread and determination. He was about to upend his world, but he knew it was the right thing to do. Ben spent the next few days tirelessly gathering evidence against Officer Reeves. He knew he had to build an ironclad case before presenting it to his superiors. The task weighed heavily on him, but the thought of Brina and Alina kept him going. He started by revisiting the victims he'd encountered during his initial investigation. Ben spoke with elderly couples, single parents, and struggling families, all of whom had fallen prey to the same financial scam. As he listened to their stories, a pattern began to emerge. It was like he knew exactly when we were most vulnerable. Mrs. Johnson, an elderly widow, told Ben with tears in her eyes. "Right after my Henry passed, this nice officer came by to offer his condolences. Next thing I knew, I was investing my life savings in some scheme." Ben's heart ached as he heard similar accounts from others. Each victim described a friendly, trustworthy police officer who had gained their confidence before introducing them to the fraudulent investment opportunity. As he pieced together the evidence, Ben realized the scope of Reeves's operation was far larger than he'd initially thought. Alina's family wasn't an isolated incident. They were just one thread in a complex web of deceit. Ben spent long nights at his kitchen table, poring over financial records and victim statements. He created a timeline of Reeves's activities, mapping out how the officer had systematically targeted vulnerable members of the community. The more Ben uncovered, the more his anger grew. How could someone sworn to protect and serve exploit the very people who trusted him most? It went against everything Ben believed in as a police officer. One evening, as Ben was reviewing his notes, he came across a detail that made his blood run cold. Several victims mentioned that Reeves had approached them shortly after they'd filed police reports for various incidents. It dawned on Ben that Reeves must have been using the department's database to identify potential targets. This realization added another layer of betrayal to Reeves's crimes. Not only was he abusing his position as a police officer, but he was also misusing confidential information to further his scheme. Ben knew he had to tread carefully. If Reeves caught wind of the investigation, he might try to cover his tracks or worse, retaliate against the victims. Ben worked discreetly, careful not to arouse suspicion among his colleagues. As the evidence mounted, Ben felt a mix of satisfaction and dread. He was building a strong case, but he knew that presenting it would forever change his life and career. Still, when he thought of Brina's frightened face and Alina's struggle, he knew he couldn't back down. Ben's investigation continued in hushed tones and quiet meetings. He worked tirelessly, always looking over his shoulder, afraid that one wrong move might alert Officer Reeves to his suspicions. The weight of responsibility pressed down on him with each passing day. As he sat in his patrol car parked in a secluded spot near the edge of town, Ben rubbed his tired eyes. He hadn't been sleeping well, his mind constantly churning with worry for Brina and Alina. The image of the little girl's frightened face haunted him, reminding him of his own daughter and the pain of losing her. "I can't let it happen again," he muttered to himself, his voice barely audible over the soft hum of the car's engine. Ben glanced at his watch and sighed. It had been 3 days since he'd last seen Brina, and there was still no sign of Alina. The hospital staff had been calling him daily, their concern growing with each missed appointment. He knew he was running out of time. Every moment he spent gathering evidence was another moment Brina spent alone, scared, and possibly in danger. The thought made his stomach churn with anxiety. Ben pulled out his notebook, flipping through the pages filled with scribbled notes and connections. He had enough to prove Reeves's involvement in the scam, but was it enough to bring him down? Would it be enough to protect Brina and Alina? As he stared at the pages, a realization hit him like a punch to the gut. He couldn't wait any longer. The risk of Reeves discovering his investigation was growing by the hour, and Alina's disappearance was becoming more concerning with each passing day. "I have to confront him," Ben whispered, his hands tightening on the steering wheel. "It's now or never." The decision filled him with a mix of determination and fear. Confronting a fellow officer, especially one as well-respected as Reeves, could end his career. But as he thought of Brina's trusting eyes and the note she'd slipped him, Ben knew he had no choice. The note saying "I'm sorry" has been a symbol of a child crying for help. Ben knew that the reason Brina slipped the note was because Alina knew an officer had done something bad to her mother, and she was apologizing in the hope that things would get better. He started the car, his mind racing as he planned his next move. He'd have to be careful, strategic. One wrong step could not only jeopardize the case but could put Brina and Alina in even more danger. As Ben drove toward the station, his heart pounded in his chest. He knew that once he walked through those doors, there was no turning back. Everything would change, for better or worse. Ben's heart raced as he approached the police station, his mind focused on confronting Officer Reeves. But just as he reached for the door handle, his phone buzzed. It was a text from an unknown number. His blood ran cold as he read the message. "We have the children, back off or they'll suffer." Ben's world came crashing down around him, Brina and her little brother taken. He stumbled back to his car, barely able to breathe. The weight of failure pressed down on him, threatening to crush his spirit. "No, no, no," he muttered, his voice breaking. "Not again. I can't lose them too." Memories of his daughter flooded his mind, mixing with images of Brina's frightened face. He'd promised himself he wouldn't let another child down, and now this. The pain was almost unbearable. But as the initial shock wore off, a fierce determination took its place. Ben's jaw clenched, his eyes hardening with resolve. He wouldn't give up. He couldn't. "I'm coming for you, Brina," he whispered, gripping the steering wheel tightly. "I won't let them hurt you or your brother." Ben knew he had to act fast. The stakes were higher than ever now. It wasn't just about exposing a corrupt officer anymore. It was about saving 2 innocent children from God knows what. He started the car, his mind racing. He needed to be smart, to think like the detective he was. Where would they take the kids? Who else might be involved? As he drove, Ben's determination grew stronger with each passing moment. The fear and guilt were still there, gnawing at the edges of his mind, but they fueled his resolve rather than paralyzing him. "I'm going to bring you down, Reeves," Ben said through gritted teeth, "and I'm going to save those kids if it's the last thing I do." He knew the road ahead would be dangerous. Reeves and his accomplices had already shown they were willing to go to extreme lengths to protect their scheme. But Ben was prepared to risk everything, his career, his reputation, even his life, to make things right. As he sped through the quiet streets of the town, Ben's mind was clear for the first time in days. He had a mission now, a purpose that burned brighter than his own pain and guilt. He would find Brina and her brother, expose the corruption, and finally bring justice to those who needed it most. The sun was setting, casting long shadows across the road. Ben knew that somewhere out there, 2 scared children were counting on him, and this time, he wouldn't let them down. Ben's heart pounded as he stood outside Officer Reeves's office. He took a deep breath, steeling himself for what was to come. With trembling hands, he pushed open the door. "Reeves," Ben said, his voice steady despite his nerves. We need to talk. The corrupt officer looked up, surprise flickering across his face before settling into a smug smile. Hartman, what can I do for you? Ben stepped forward, placing a thick folder on Reeves's desk. I know what you've been doing. The scams, the exploitation of vulnerable families. It ends now. Reeves's smile faltered. I don't know what you're talking about. Don't play dumb, Ben growled. I've got evidence. Testimonies from victims, bank records, everything. You're going down for this. The room crackled with tension as Reeves slowly stood up. You're making a big mistake, Hartman. Think about your career, your reputation. Is it worth throwing it all away? Ben's jaw clenched. To protect innocent people? To save those kids? Absolutely. Reeves lunged for his desk drawer, but Ben was faster. He tackled the corrupt officer, sending them both crashing to the floor. They grappled fiercely, knocking over chairs and scattering papers. Help! Reeves shouted. Officer down! Footsteps thundered down the hallway. The door burst open as other officers rushed in, weapons drawn. Stop! Ben yelled, pinning Reeves to the ground. This man is corrupt. There's evidence on his desk. He's been running a scam, exploiting families, and now he's taken 2 children hostage. The room fell silent as the other officers looked between Ben and Reeves, confusion etched on their faces. He's lying, Reeves spat. Hartman's lost it. Arrest him. But Ben's words had sown seeds of doubt. One officer cautiously approached the desk, picking up the folder Ben had brought. Sir, the officer said, flipping through the pages. There's a lot of evidence here. Bank statements, victim testimonies. Reeves's face paled. He struggled against Ben's grip, but it was too late. The truth was out. As Reeves was handcuffed and led away, Ben felt a moment of triumph. But it was short-lived. Brina and her brother were still missing. Where are the kids, Reeves? Ben demanded. Tell me. Reeves just smirked. You'll never find them in time, Hartman. Ben's blood ran cold. He'd exposed the corruption, but at what cost? Now he faced his greatest challenge yet, finding Brina and her brother before it was too late. That late afternoon, Ben's heart raced as he sped towards the abandoned warehouse on the outskirts of town. The lead from Reeves's accomplice echoed in his mind, a glimmer of hope in the darkness. This could be his last chance to save Brina and her brother. As he pulled up to the dilapidated building, Ben's hand trembled on his gun. He took a deep breath, steadying himself. I won't fail them, he whispered, memories of his daughter flashing through his mind. The rusty door creaked as Ben forced it open. Shadows danced across the walls, cast by the fading sunlight streaming through broken windows. Every step echoed in the empty space, making Ben wince. Brina, he called softly, straining to hear any response. A muffled sound caught his attention. Ben's heart leapt as he followed it, weaving through piles of abandoned crates and machinery. At the back of the warehouse, he found a locked door. Brina, are you in there? Ben called, pressing his ear to the cold metal. Help! A small voice cried out. Please help us! Ben's eyes welled with tears of relief. I'm here, Brina. I'm going to get you out. With a few well-placed kicks, the lock gave way. Ben burst into the room, his eyes adjusting to the darkness. There, huddled in the corner, were Brina and her little brother. Officer Ben, Brina cried, her voice trembling with fear and hope. Ben rushed to them, kneeling down and wrapping his arms around both children. You're safe now, he murmured, his voice thick with emotion. I've got you. You're going to be okay. Brina clung to him, sobbing into his shoulder. Her brother, too young to fully understand what was happening, nestled against Ben's chest. As Ben held them close, a wave of emotions washed over him. Relief, joy, and a deep sense of purpose he hadn't felt in years. In Brina's tear-stained face, he saw a reflection of his own daughter, a chance at redemption he never thought he'd have. Let's get you home, Ben said gently, standing up with the children still in his arms. As he carried them out of the warehouse and into the warm sunlight, Ben felt a weight lift from his shoulders. He had saved them, and in doing so, he had saved a part of himself too. In the days following the dramatic rescue and the corrupt officer's arrest, the police department was in turmoil. News of the scandal spread like wildfire, leaving everyone stunned and confused. Ben found himself at the center of it all, a reluctant hero thrust into the spotlight. As he walked into the precinct one morning, Ben could feel the weight of his colleagues' stares. Some looked at him with admiration, others with suspicion. The air was thick with tension, and whispers followed him down the hallway. Captain Santos called Ben into his office, his face a mask of conflicting emotions. "Hartman," he began, his voice gruff, "I don't know whether to commend you or reprimand you." Ben stood tall, his resolve unwavering. "I did what I had to do, sir. That officer was exploiting vulnerable families. I couldn't stand by and let it happen." The captain sighed heavily, rubbing his temples. "You went against one of our own, Ben. That's not something we take lightly." "With all due respect, sir," Ben replied, his voice steady. "He stopped being one of our own the moment he chose to break the law and hurt innocent people." Captain Santos nodded slowly, a hint of pride in his eyes. "You're right, of course. But this isn't going to be easy. Internal Affairs is going to be all over this, and some of the other officers, well, they're not happy." As if on cue, Officer Johnson burst into the office, his face red with anger. "How could you do this, Hartman?" he shouted. "You've made us all look bad." Ben turned to face his colleague, his voice calm but firm. "No, Johnson. He made us look bad by abusing his power. I did what was right, and I'd do it again in a heartbeat." The confrontation drew attention, and soon a small crowd had gathered outside the captain's office. Some officers nodded in agreement with Ben, while others scowled disapprovingly. Ben stepped out of the office facing his colleagues. He took a deep breath and spoke from his heart. "I know this is hard for all of us. We're supposed to be a family, to trust each other. But our first duty is to protect and serve the public. That little girl and her family needed our help, and I couldn't turn my back on them." His words seemed to resonate with many of the officers. Slowly, the tension in the room began to ease. Officer Martinez stepped forward, placing a hand on Ben's shoulder. "You did good, Hartman. It took guts to stand up like that." As the days passed, Ben's actions continued to be scrutinized. Internal Affairs interviewed him multiple times, digging into every detail of his investigation. But through it all, Ben remained steadfast. He knew in his heart that he had done the right thing and that knowledge gave him strength. As the dust settled from the investigation and arrests, Ben received a call that made his heart race. Alina had been found alive. Without hesitation, he rushed to the hospital, his mind a whirlwind of emotions. When Ben arrived, he found Alina in a hospital bed looking frail and exhausted. Her skin was pale and dark circles shadowed her eyes. Despite her weakened state, there was a spark of life in her gaze that hadn't been there before. "Officer Hartman," Alina said softly, her voice barely above a whisper. "Thank you for everything you've done." Ben swallowed hard, fighting back the lump in his throat. "I'm just glad we found you, Mrs. Willow. How are you feeling?" Alina managed a small smile. "I've been better, but I'm alive. That's what matters." Her eyes suddenly widened with worry. "My children, are they safe?" Ben nodded quickly, reassuring her. "They're safe, Mrs. Willow. They're on their way here right now." Relief washed over Alina's face and tears welled up in her eyes. "Thank God," she whispered. Just then the door burst open and Brina rushed in, followed closely by her younger brother. "Mom!" Brina cried out, her voice a mix of joy and disbelief. Alina's face lit up at the sight of her children. "Brina! Oh, my babies!" she exclaimed, her arms outstretched. Brina ran to her mother's bedside, practically leaping onto the bed to embrace her. Alina winced slightly from the impact, but held her daughter tightly, tears streaming down her face. Her son joined the hug, his small arms wrapping around both of them. "I was so scared, Mom," Brina sobbed, her words muffled against her mother's hospital gown. "I didn't know what to do." Alina stroked her daughter's hair, her voice soothing despite her own tears. "You did so well, sweetheart. You were so brave. I'm so proud of you." Ben watched the scene unfold from the corner of the room, his heart swelling with emotion. The joy and relief on their faces were palpable, filling the room with a warmth that seemed to push away the shadows of their recent ordeal. As he observed the family's reunion, Ben felt a sense of fulfillment wash over him. The weight he had carried for so long seemed to lift, if only a little. He had made a difference. He had helped bring this family back together. Brina looked up from her mother's embrace, her eyes finding Ben. She gave him a watery smile, mouthing a silent, "Thank you." Ben nodded in response, his own eyes glistening with unshed tears. In the weeks following Alina's rescue, Ben found himself drawn back to the Willow family time and again. His visits started as simple check-ins, but soon became a regular part of his routine. One sunny afternoon, Ben knocked on the Willow's front door, a bag of groceries in his arms. Brina answered, her face lighting up at the sight of him. "Officer Ben," she exclaimed, her shyness now replaced with genuine warmth. Ben smiled, his heart lifting at her enthusiasm. "Hey there, kiddo. How's your mom doing today?" Brina led him inside, chattering about her mother's progress. Alina was seated on the couch, looking tired but much healthier than she had in the hospital. "Ben," Alina greeted him with a soft smile, "you didn't have to bring groceries again." He shrugged, setting the bag down in the kitchen. "It's no trouble. I was in the neighborhood anyway." As the days turned into weeks, Ben found himself spending more and more time with the Willows. He'd help Brina with her homework, play catch with her little brother in the backyard, and assist Alina with her physical therapy exercises. One evening, as Ben was washing dishes after dinner, Alina approached him. "Ben," she said quietly, "I don't know how to thank you for everything you've done for us." He turned to her, drying his hands on a dish towel. "You don't need to thank me, Alina. I'm just glad I can help." Alina's eyes welled with tears. "You've become such an important part of our lives. The children adore you, and I—" She trailed off, looking away. Ben felt a warmth spread through his chest. For the first time in years, he felt like he belonged somewhere, like he was part of something bigger than himself. As the months passed, Ben's visits became more frequent. He'd stop by after his shifts, sometimes still in uniform, to read bedtime stories to the kids or to share a quiet cup of tea with Alina after they'd gone to sleep. One Saturday morning, Ben arrived to find Brina attempting to make pancakes for her mother's birthday. The kitchen was a mess of flour and spilled batter. "Looks like you could use a hand," Ben chuckled, rolling up his sleeves. Brina grinned sheepishly. "I wanted to surprise Mom, but it's harder than I thought." Together they managed to salvage the pancakes, and when Alina woke up to the smell of breakfast and the sound of laughter, her eyes filled with happy tears. As they sat around the table enjoying their slightly misshapen but delicious pancakes, Ben looked at the faces around him. Brina was giggling at her brother's syrup-covered face, while Alina watched her children with love and contentment. In that moment, Ben realized he had become more than just a visitor or a helper. He had become a protector, a caregiver, and most importantly, a part of this family. The hole in his heart, left by the loss of his own family, was slowly beginning to heal. As the weeks turned into months, Alina's health continued to improve, thanks in no small part to Ben's unwavering support. His presence had become a constant in their lives, a source of comfort and stability that the Willow family had desperately needed. One evening, after the children had gone to bed, Alina and Ben sat on the porch enjoying the cool night air. Alina turned to Ben, her eyes shining with gratitude. "Ben," she said softly, "I don't know how we would have made it through all of this without you." Ben felt a warmth spread through his chest at her words. He shook his head modestly. "You're stronger than you give yourself credit for, Alina. You and the kids would have been just fine." Alina reached out and placed her hand on his arm. "Maybe, but you've made it so much easier. You've become such an important part of our lives." Ben felt his throat tighten with emotion. He hadn't realized how much he'd needed to hear those words, to feel needed and valued again. As the days passed, Ben found himself spending more and more time at the Willow house. He'd join them for dinner, help Brina with her homework, and even started teaching her little brother how to throw a baseball. One Sunday afternoon, as they all sat around the kitchen table enjoying a meal Ben had cooked, Alina couldn't help but marvel at how natural it all felt. Ben fit into their lives so seamlessly, it was as if he'd always been there. "This pot roast is delicious, Ben," Alina said, savoring another bite. "Where did you learn to cook like this?" Ben's eyes took on a distant look for a moment. "My wife taught me," he said softly. "She always said a good meal could heal the soul." Alina reached across the table and squeezed his hand. She was a wise woman. Ben nodded, a small smile playing on his lips. She was. As they continued to share meals and stories, Ben felt something he hadn't experienced in years, a sense of belonging. The walls he had built around his heart after losing his family began to crumble, piece by piece. One evening, as they sat on the porch swing watching the sunset, Alina turned to Ben. "You know," she said softly, "you've brought so much light back into our lives. I hope you know how much you mean to us." "To me?" Ben felt his heart swell with emotion. He looked at Alina, seeing the warmth and affection in her eyes, and for the first time in years, he allowed himself to hope for a future filled with love and family once again. As the days turned into weeks, Ben found himself drawn deeper into the Willow family's world. The protective instincts that had first led him to help Brina now extended to her entire family. He felt a profound connection to them, one that filled the emptiness he'd carried for so long. Ben's demeanor began to change slowly but noticeably. The hardened exterior he'd worn like armor for years started to soften. His eyes, once clouded with sadness, now sparkled with warmth when he was around the Willows. He smiled more often, and his laughter, once a rare sound, now filled the house regularly. Brina and her brother eagerly awaited Ben's visits. They'd rush to the door when they heard his car pull up, their faces beaming with excitement. Ben found himself looking forward to these moments just as much as the children did. "Officer Ben!" Brina would call out, her shyness long forgotten. "Can we play catch in the backyard?" Ben's heart would swell at her enthusiasm. "Of course, kiddo," he'd reply, ruffling her hair affectionately. They'd spend hours in the backyard, Ben teaching them how to throw a perfect spiral, or showing them card tricks he'd learned as a boy. The sound of their laughter was music to his ears, healing parts of him he thought were broken beyond repair. In the evenings, after the kids had gone to bed, Ben and Alina would sit on the porch, talking softly as the stars came out. These quiet moments became a cherished ritual for both of them. "I never thought I'd feel this way again," Alina confessed one night, her voice barely above a whisper. "Like there's hope for the future." Ben nodded, understanding exactly what she meant. "Life has a way of surprising us," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "Sometimes, when we least expect it, we find something worth living for." They'd share their struggles, their fears, and their dreams for the future. Ben opened up about the pain of losing his wife and daughter, something he'd never been able to do before. Alina listened with compassion, offering comfort through her presence and understanding. As the weeks passed, Ben found himself lingering longer each evening, reluctant to leave the warmth and comfort of the Willow home. He'd help tuck the kids into bed, reading them stories and checking for monsters under the bed. Then he and Alina would talk, sometimes for hours, about their hopes and plans for the days ahead. The day of Brina's school event arrived, and Ben felt a mix of excitement and nervousness as he adjusted his tie in the mirror. He had never attended a school function as a guest before, and the significance of this moment wasn't lost on him. With a deep breath, he grabbed his keys and headed out the door. As Ben walked into the school auditorium, he was struck by the buzz of excitement in the air. Parents, teachers, and students milled about, chatting and laughing. He scanned the crowd, searching for familiar faces. "Ben, over here!" Alina's voice called out. He turned to see Alina waving, a bright smile on her face. As he made his way over, he felt a small hand slip into his. Looking down, he saw Brina beaming up at him, her eyes shining with happiness. "You came," she said softly, giving his hand a squeeze. Ben's heart swelled with emotion. "Of course I did, kiddo. I wouldn't miss it for the world." They found their seats, and as the program began, Ben felt a sense of pride he hadn't experienced in years. He watched as various students took the stage, sharing their stories and achievements, but his eyes kept drifting to Brina, fidgeting nervously in her seat as she waited for her turn. Finally, the principal announced, "And now we have a special presentation from Brina May Willow." Ben gave Brina's shoulder a reassuring squeeze as she stood up. She took a deep breath and made her way to the stage, her steps steady and determined. As she reached the microphone, she pulled something from her pocket, a folded piece of paper that Ben recognized immediately. Brina's voice, usually so quiet, rang out clear and strong. "A few months ago, I wrote 2 words on this piece of paper. Just 2 simple words that changed my life forever." She unfolded the note, holding it up for everyone to see. "I'm sorry," she read aloud. 2 words that have several deep meanings. Ben felt his throat tighten with emotion as Brina continued. "I was scared and alone, and I didn't know who to turn to. But then I met someone who showed me that there are good people in this world. Someone who taught me that it's okay to ask for help when you need it." Brina's eyes found Ben's in the audience, and she smiled. "Officer Ben Hartman didn't just help me and my family. He became a part of our family. He showed us what it means to care, to protect, and to love." Tears welled up in Ben's eyes as Brina spoke. He felt Alina's hand slip into his, offering silent support. "2 words changed my life," Brina said, her voice growing stronger. "And now I want to say 2 more. Thank you. Thank you, Ben, for being there when we needed you most, for showing me that sometimes the bravest thing we can do is ask for help." As Brina finished her speech, the auditorium erupted in applause. Ben stood up, tears streaming down his face, his heart overflowing with love and gratitude for this little girl who had brought so much light back into his life. As the weeks passed, Ben found himself spending more and more time with Brina's family. He would stop by their house after his shifts, often bringing groceries or helping with household repairs. The once quiet home now rang with laughter and warmth. One evening, as Ben was fixing a leaky faucet in the kitchen, Alina stood nearby, handing him tools and chatting about her day. Their eyes met, and for a moment, time seemed to stand still. Ben felt a flutter in his chest, a feeling he hadn't experienced in years. Alina blushed and looked away, but the connection between them was undeniable. As the days went by, they found themselves seeking out each other's company more often. Their conversations grew deeper, sharing hopes, fears, and dreams. One Saturday afternoon, while Brina and her brother were playing in the backyard, Ben and Alina sat on the porch swing watching the children. Without thinking, Ben reached out and took Alina's hand in his. She didn't pull away. "Alina," Ben said softly, his voice filled with emotion. "I never thought I'd feel this way again. But being here, with you and the kids, it's like I've found a piece of myself I thought was lost forever." Alina squeezed his hand, tears glistening in her eyes. "Oh, Ben, you've become such an important part of our lives. I think I'm falling in love with you." Ben's heart soared at her words. He leaned in, gently cupping her face with his free hand. "I love you too, Alina. You and the kids. You've given me a second chance at happiness." Their lips met in a tender kiss filled with promise and hope for the future. That evening, as they all sat around the dinner table, the atmosphere was electric with joy. Brina and her brother giggled as Ben told silly jokes, and Alina's laughter joined theirs, filling the room with a melody of happiness. As Ben looked around at the smiling faces, he felt a sense of completeness wash over him. Here, in this unexpected chapter of his life, he had found not just a new family, but healing for his wounded heart. The pain of his past, while never forgotten, no longer overshadowed his present. If you enjoyed the story of Officer Ben, Brina, and Alina, I handpicked this next story that will touch your heart. Please don't miss this one. Click here to watch it.